and welcome to my lecture recital entitled Creative Influence, American Applications of the Scottish Rudimental Style. Drumming styles are synonymous with spoken languages, with mild to drastic variations in how they're spoken and written based on geographical origin. Many share a notation system just as languages share alphabets. They may also use similar rudimental vocabulary, but with slight variations in the rudiments and techniques used to apply them, similar to a British or Australian accent. How the exact combinations of right and left-hand stroke types came to comprise and solidify each of these languages was dependent on local culture, technological advancement, and even world wars. After their solidification, their continued evolution was dependent on creativity, which, for the most successful innovators, was a product of cross-cultural pollination. The purpose of this lecture recital is to answer three questions. How did the American and Scottish styles of drumming originate? To what degree was influence drawn from other styles of drumming throughout the development and eventual solidification of these styles? And how can creative influence be drawn from the modern Scottish rudimental style and applied in the context of Western concert snare drum playing? In this lecture, I'll present a brief history of the development of Scottish and American drumming styles, discuss the differences between the two, and demonstrate creative applications of the Scottish rudimental vocabulary into standard solo concert snare drum repertoire. I will conclude with performances demonstrating both the American and Scottish styles of drumming, as well as a piece featuring a Scottish-American hybrid approach. How did these two styles of drumming originate? Sources agree that rudimental drumming was born with the first pairing of the drum and fife in Basel, Switzerland in the 1300s. Over the next several hundred years, Swiss mercenaries serving in foreign armies would spread this culture throughout France, England, Scotland, and eventually the United States during the American Revolution. One of the first widely accepted uses of drums was in the military, where their initial purpose was to facilitate communication. On large military campgrounds, battlefields, or even entire communities, the volume needed to communicate successfully was too much for the voice to handle. In the absence of sound amplification technology, this volume was more easily achieved with drums. Thus, a new language was born, consisting of various rudiment and beat combinations, each carrying a specific message. Members of these militaries and communities were expected to recognize this language, just as we expect our children to know words and phrases such as stop or watch your step. At the time, ignorance of this percussive dialect could have had life-threatening consequences. I will begin with American rudimental drumming history. Shortly after the birth of the United States, in the General Orders of June 4, 1777, George Washington wrote, "The music of the army being in general very bad, it is expected that the drum and fife majors exert themselves to improve it, or they will be reduced and their extraordinary pay taken from them." Shortly after this statement, efforts were made to improve musical performance in the military. This included a clear and concise regimen of drum calls, their meanings, and when they were played, which became the camp duty. As the military became increasingly more organized, drum majors began producing written drum manuals containing not only instructions for the camp duty, but also sheet music for fifes and drums. The 1800s yielded a long list of drum manuals through which drum notation would slowly begin to evolve. The first manual of importance in America was A New, Useful, and Complete Guide of Drum Beating by Charles Stewart Ashworth in 1812. This is the first publication in which the word rudiments is used to describe sticking patterns. The manual hosts a list of 26 rudiments, many of which are no longer used by modern percussionists and drummers. The British equivalent to the Ashworth manual was The Art of Beating the Drum by Samuel Potter, published in 1815. Although the Potter Manual does not use the term rudiments, it does feature a list of 21 things to learn. The next important military drum manual came nearly 50 years later, with George Bruce and Daniel D. Emmett's Drummers and Fifers Guide in 1862. Praised by military leaders and composers as the only reliable and standard work for the drummers and fifers of our country, this was the first manual considered to be truly comprehensive, with instructional details designed for even non-musicians to teach themselves, rudiment guides with indicated stickings, and drummer's calls. It also featured a wide variety of modern interpretations and arrangements of traditional tunes, such as The Downfall of Paris, many of which were adopted as the new standard following its publishing. The Bruce Nimmitt Guide moved away from previous methods of notation, using a single space of the 5-line staff with stems pointing downwards. Although many other drum manuals existed throughout the 1800s, the solidification of American rudimental drum notation is attributed to John Philip Sousa. His Book of Instruction for the Trumpet and Drum was the first to indicate sticking with the letters R and L beneath the notation. Within the next 50 years, this was to become the standard style of rudimental drumming notation in the United States. Similar to George Washington's note, this manual was also a response to the lack of precision in military bands during the 1880s. John Philip Sousa was also instrumental in the switch from fife to bugle corps, and single-handedly transformed the role of the military band in the United States. It was during his reign that rudimental drumming began to break ties with the military. With the explosion of musical styles in the early 1900s, including ragtime, jazz, and civilian marching bands, the rudiments were cast down a variety of paths and musical applications. As marching bands became more recreational, university marching bands became more involved and would be performing regularly in halftime shows by the 1900s. After the conclusion of World War I, many musicians involved in the war began forming civilian drum corps. These drum corps solidified marching band music as part of American culture, simultaneously spreading the popularity of the drum corps and rudimental drumming across the country. To put this popularity in perspective, in 1936, the 15th National American Legion Convention Parade in Chicago featured 284 drum corps, 400,000 legionnaires, and more than 1.5 million spectators. Throughout the 1920s, the emergence of the drum set and jazz diminished the desire to learn rudiments as a formality. Variations on teaching them led to disagreement between many popular drummers at the time, and eventually efforts were made to standardize them for educational purposes. So, in 1932, 13 of the most prominent and talented drummers in the United States, led by William F. Ludwig, gathered in Chicago to form the National Association of Rudimental Drummers. The initial goal of the NARD was to create an updated rudiment list that did not deviate from the well-established methods at the time. In 1933, the organization selected 26 rudiments, which would become the standard American rudiments. Additionally, they split the rudiments into two sections, selecting 13 that would serve as the audition requirement for NARD membership. These 13 became the 13 essential rudiments. The 1940s, 30s, 40s, and 50s would yield a number of important rudimental drumming publications, all of which remain popular in the modern curriculum. It is important to understand that each of these authors were also exceptional educators, whose influence spread throughout the US like wildfire. Take, for example, George Lawrence Stone. After the publication of Stick Control, the demand for his teaching grew exponentially, with even the best drummers seeking out his instruction. These include Gene Krupa, Sid Catlett, Lionel Hampton, Joe Morello, just to name a few. And the following is an abbreviated list of modern drummers who have studied with at least one of Stone's many students, evidence that his teachings are still highly valued in modern drumming society. Aside from the innovative efforts of a handful of drummers, the evolution of the drums themselves also had an enormous impact on the type of vocabulary being played. The invention of mylar drumheads in 1957, largely due to the efforts of Remo Belli, Chick Evans, and the Ludwig Drum Company, ushered in a new era allowing for greater tension than that of calfskin heads. As drum heads tightened, the increased rebound offered an opportunity for more notes with less effort, and the playing style began to close, meaning more notes in less time. The pitch of the drums also increased, yielding sharper articulation, thus demanding a much higher standard in ensemble clarity. This standard of cleanliness would be defined throughout the 60s and 70s with the birth of Drum Corps Associates in 1962, a competitive circuit for all age and senior drum and bugle corps in the United States. This would grow even further in 1972 with the emergence of Drum Corps International, the junior version of DCA. most sources agree that it was through DCI that the art of rudimental drumming evolved into its contemporary state. As with any activity, there were countless rudimental drummers whose efforts stood out above the rest, such as Ralph Hardiman, John Wooten, and Jeff Queen. In 1984, the Marching Committee of the Percussive Art Society published another rudiment list entitled the Percussive Art Society International Drum Rudiments. This list added 14 more rudiments to the original list of 26 to add up to a total of 40. This list has remained the standard for American percussionists, but has yet to gain traction throughout the rest of the world due to the cultural insensitivity with which it was created and its bias towards rudiments used in the United States. Of the 40 rudiments, one should also note that only one of these, the flamacue, originated in the United States. The rest of the 39 rudiments were inherited from other drumming styles and cultures. Throughout the 1990s and first part of the 21st century, Drum Corps International continued to contribute to the growth of the American rudimental vocabulary. The competitive nature of this organization drives the innovation of instrument quality, sound production, and rudimental vocabulary to new heights. For the drum corps competing, there's no higher honor than the World Championship title, and for participating percussionists, the Fred Sanford High Percussion Award. As DCI continued to push the boundaries of rudimental performance, concepts that were exclusive to solo performance became new standards of ensemble expectation. Backsticking, stick tosses, and a variety of other stick tricks quickly became standard visual effects in drum corps battery sections. The level of rhythmic precision achieved in these young drum corps has also redefined American expectations regarding marching ensemble clarity. Just as Stone's students carried on his legacy and teachings, the influence of drummers who participated in these drum corps has had a lasting effect on the overall level of rudimental drumming in the United States. This advanced drumming culture resulted in such a wide variety of new rudiments and rudiment combinations that an entirely new category had to be created. In the early 2000s, Jim Campbell and Yamaha compiled a list of hybrid rudiments, many of which derived from the drum corps activity. One of the most popular modern rudimental composers is Joseph Tompkins, whose 3 volumes of 9 French-American rudimental solos have become standards in the percussion community. In these volumes, Tompkins blends the influence of French rudimental drummer Guy Lafrève with the American style of rudimental drumming. The popularity of this hybrid approach is all the evidence one needs to begin exploring other cross-cultural applications of rudimental drumming styles. Scottish pipe band drumming history. According to an 1849 publication entitled Musical Memoirs of Scotland by Sir John Graham Dollier, the use of the side drum in the Scottish military was recorded as 1533. By 1637, soldiers were being trained to differentiate between the various drum signals, such as the tattoo, the reveille, and the march. As drum calls would become, these drum calls would become known as the Scots duty, which would remain in standard use until the publication of Samuel Potter's System of Instruction for the Drum and Fife in 1816. Although there is evidence of pipes and drums performing together previously, it was not until 1854 that bagpipes were officially recognized by the military in the United Kingdom. As these differing styles of pipes and drums were bred, army pipe bands were born. This is where the terms pipe major and drum major originated, titles which are still used in modern pipe bands even in the absence of military ties. By the 1880s, Scottish pipe bands began to break free from the chains of the military, beginning with the Jovan Berg and Edinburgh Police pipe bands. For several years, civilian pipe bands were tied exclusively to police and fire departments, and it wasn't until 1887 that the first civilian pipe band with no association with the military or police and fire departments was born. By the 1890s, civilian pipe bands began to proliferate, with bands popping up in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, and the United States by 1910. In 1906, the Highland Games in Cowell, Scotland hosted its first ever pipe band championship, and the competitive culture of pipe band playing began to surge. This was, however, only open to police and fire department pipe bands until 1909, when the games opened to civilian pipe bands. During World War II, the newly established pipe band championships will be put on hold, as the draft included many of its key participants. Some articles suggest that up to 10,000 pipers worldwide lost their lives in the war. Up until the 1920s, Scottish pipe band drummers utilized stock scores from military drum manuals. Bagpipe music is derived from traditional Celtic tunes from Scotland, Ireland, France, and Canada, dating back hundreds of years. Other than the addition of various embellishments, the phrasal and melodic structure of bagpipe music has remained the same. Pipe band drummers would simply search through one of these manuals and find a score that could be adapted to fit the bagpipe tune. As many pipe band drummers did not read music, drum parts were largely taught by rote, and even the idea of learning to read notation was a burden to most involved in the activity. During World War I, drum major John Seton spent time studying music theory in hopes of gaining the necessary knowledge to write out his own scores. Seton is the first documented writer of Scottish pipe band scores, with his earliest written in 1919. This early relic reveals the true scope of evolution that was to come within the next 100 years. As you can see, his drum scores are written using standard military drum notation, straight rhythms, and what appears to be an accompanying bass drum part. Seton was also the first drummer to write custom drum scores to fit each bagpipe tune. The next influential contributor would be drum major Alexander Douglas Hamilton. In the 1920s, A.D. spent time playing with orchestras and dance bands, where he was likely introduced to the art of swing. And in 1931, he published a book entitled Drum Scores, a collection of scores for side drum, tenor, and bass drum. Not only does the title itself suggest that tenor drums were accepted as a vital element of pipe bands by the 1930s, but the scores found in this publication present the first evidence of the closed drag style and swung 16th note patterns. Until the 1930s, rope tension drums and calfskin drumheads were the standard. In 1930, Premier Drum Company introduced the first rod tension drum to Scotland. When drum major Jimmy Catherwood in the Dalziel Highland Drum Corps showed up wielding these new drums at the World Pipe Band Championships in 1931, at first they were made fun of for their, quote, biscuit tins. However, after winning the championship, others followed suit, and rod tension drums became the standard by the 1940s. The extra tension of these drums allowed for faster, lighter, and brighter articulation, thus pushing the envelope of the rudimental vocabulary being used. Catherwood was also the first to make significant contributions to the rudimental vocabulary. He served as an ambassador for the Scottish drumming style throughout the 1930s, and in 1932 he traveled to the United States, where he corresponded with William Ludwig, who named Jimmy an honorary member of the newly created National Association of Rudimental Drummers. His experiences with Ludwig allowed him to return to Scotland with American rudimental influence, which he had then injected into the Scottish pipe band style. Jimmy also spent time studying the Swiss style in Basel, Switzerland, with the legendary Dr. Fritz Berger. In 1928, Dr. Berger invented the monolinear notation style, utilizing a single line with right-hand notes above and left-hand notes below the line. This style is much easier for beginners to read, as the sticking and rhythm are embodied singularly, as opposed to the American style, in which the rhythm and sticking must be interpreted separately. Upon returning to Scotland in 1937, Catherwood became an advocate for Berger's notation style, which would become the standard by the 1950s. Fascinated by the accented roll passages characteristic of the Swiss drumming style, Jimmy was inspired to apply this to Scottish pipe band drumming, resulting in the closed accented roll patterns typical of modern pipe band drumming. From 1939 to 45, World War II placed another significant halt on rudimental development. After the war, a new road was paved by a younger generation of players. In the late 1940s, pipe bands became more adventurous with their music selection, and as the vocabulary intensified, so did the quality of gear, as it had to improve to meet their musical needs. After the war, another influential drummer named Gordon Jelly worked with Premier Drum Company to create the Royal Scot drum model. By 1950, the Royal Scot included batterhead snares, producing a much brighter, sharper, and more articulate sound. In 1953, mylar heads entered the scene, further improving this articulation. From the 1950s onward, the single most influential innovator of the pipe band drumming style was a man by the name of Alex Duthard. Like Catherwood, Duthard also understood and appreciated the value of other cultures and musical styles. He spent time studying both Swiss and American drumming styles, which had evolved since Catherwood had done so, and are evident in Duthard's drum scores. Duthard even took a break from pipe band drumming altogether in 1953 to perform as a jazz drummer in local dance bands for 4 years, which would become his primary source of influence thereafter. Jazz was a style of music that was seemingly open-ended. The aspects of improvisation, groove, touch, and ensemble balance equipped Duthard with the necessary influence to facilitate the most significant changes the pipe band drumming culture has ever experienced. Upon his return to playing in pipe bands in 1957, Duthard revolutionized the way pipe band drummers approached phrasing by introducing a concept of layer dynamics known as chips and unisons. Prior to this concept, dynamic contrast in pipe band drum section was defined as loud, soft, or somewhere in between, or somewhere to and from. With Duthard's approach, the first of a repeated phrase was played only by the lead drummer, with the rest playing selected chips or hits similar to a jazz drummer. To add even more depth and contrast, he assigned more emphasis to certain notes. This was rounded off the second time through, where the entire snare section would play the full part. The musical benefits of this approach were profound. Layered dynamics created the contrast needed to cancel out the lack thereof in the bagpipes, as bagpipes have no way of controlling volume. This allowed the snare drums to emphasize particular subphrases, creating a layered musical approach both rhythmically and dynamically. The low end of the dynamic spectrum was also suddenly dropped to a level that was not achievable for an entire snare section attempting to play soft with one another. Duthard also went on to adapt the rudimental vocabulary, most notably the drag-tap combinations, which I'll be demonstrating in the vocabulary portion of the lecture. While applying a unique musician's approach to pipe band drum score writing, Duthard was also a virtuosic player and pushed the boundaries of speed and control more than any other pipe band drummer in history. In fact, the maximum speed of playing in pipe bands has decreased significantly since his time. Even after his tragic death in 1986, Alex Duthard remains the grandfather of the pipe band drumming style. His influence stretches across the globe in the form of his countless students who continue to push the boundaries of pipe band drumming performance. After discussing the origins of American and Scottish rudimental drumming, perhaps you can better understand how the materials being used serve to complement each of these styles. To review, rope tension drums were used in America up until around 1900, and in Scotland until the 1930s. The characteristic low tension of rope drums required bigger muscles to play the drums, evidenced by most instructional drum manuals of the 1800s. When rod tension drums came about in 1865, and in the US and in 1931 in Scotland, more tension yielded more rebound, higher pitch, and brighter articulation. As this pitch continued to increase with the invention of mylar heads in 1957, and furthermore Kevlar in the 1980s, the styles of playing became more and more closed, allowing players and their corps to play faster rudiments without sacrificing articulation. The main difference between modern pipe band drums and American drums is that pipe band drums have batterhead snares. The snares are both height and tension adjustable to achieve the perfect snare response. Modern pipe band snare drums are also much lighter than American marching snare drums And the heads, although made of Kevlar, are much thinner than what's typical of a standard American marching drum. You may have also noticed the difference in the sticks I'm using. American rudimental drumsticks are made from hickory, which is much heavier, more durable wood. The weight allows for more sound production with less work from the performer. And its durable qualities protect the stick from rim shots, which are very common in the modern American rudimental drum solos and ensembles. American drumsticks typically range from 16 to 17 inches in length, with slight variations from one model to the next on the amount of taper on the stick. Pipe band drumsticks are made from maple, which is much lighter and less durable than hickory. They're also much shorter than American drumsticks and have a taper that stretches almost the entire length of the stick. It also features an acorn-shaped bead, which is much larger than the average American drumstick. The light weight is primarily what gives the Scottish pipe band snare drum its bright and snappy articulation. In general, the heavier the drumstick, the darker the articulation, and the lighter the drumstick, the brighter the articulation. Furthermore, the added durability of hickory is less necessary in the Scottish style, as rim shots are not a part of the Scottish rudimental language. The light weight and longer taper also create a much different balance distribution, allowing for the use of smaller muscles in the technique and approach to the drum, which brings us to grip. Historically, American rudimental drumming features matched or German grip in the right hand and traditional grip in the left. The right hand uses a 3-point fulcrum between the thumb, index, and middle fingers, with the rest wrapped around the stick naturally. The stroke motion consists of mostly wrist, with the addition of arm for volume and fingers for faster playing. The left hand also uses a 3-point fulcrum, but between the thumb, index, and ring finger. The stroke is achieved by a rotation of the wrist, with the addition of arm for volume and thumb for faster playing. Pipe band drumming also utilizes traditional grip. Although it's perfectly natural to see people in even grade 1 pipe bands playing reverse traditional grip or even matched grip. Reverse traditional grip is simply a result of younger players mirroring their teachers in lessons when they're young to more easily replicate his or her technique when facing one another. Although the grip itself is very similar to that of American grip, the muscles used to play the drum are quite different. As mentioned previously, the sticks are much lighter and do not require as much physical strength to maneuver. The right hand uses what Americans would call match grip, only the butt of the stick rests in the middle of the palm. Similar to the American grip, the Scottish style also uses a 3-point fulcrum between the thumb, index, and middle finger, with the rest only used in rare occasions. The difference is that the majority of the playing is done with only the middle finger. For louder playing, a fluid swinging motion known as Moeller technique and named after Sanford Augustus Moeller allows for things like accents to pop out of the texture with minimal effort. The left hand is the most challenging aspect of this technique, as most of the playing is done only using the thumb. The rest of the fingers are close to the stick, but only touching it on rare occasions. This use of smaller muscles aids in the light, quick, and articulate style of pipe band drumming. Finally, whereas modern American rudimental drumming utilizes different zones of the drumhead to produce various timbres and dynamics, the pipe band style plays strictly in the center of the head at all times. With all of the factors that add up to the light style of playing, there's simply no need to change playing zones, and the presence of the batter head snares will negatively affect the sound when attempting to do so. Vocabulary and performance practice. In this portion of the lecture, I'll be demonstrating the differences in performance practices and rudimental vocabulary between the Scottish and American styles. The physical demands of American marching bands are very high. The simultaneous act of marching and playing is a key element of the performance. In competitions, the concept of uniformity is taken to new levels, with captions existing for visual and general effect, which make up a large percentage of the final score. The rudimental drumming style of these ensembles reflects this. Every note played with the hands has a metronomic relationship with the feet to create consistency of sound and body movement. In American marching music, the responsibility of tempo management defaults to the drums. In pipe band competitions, there's little to no marching involved. There are fewer instruments, 4 in total, and the ensemble typically performs standing still in a tight circle. This allows for a more intimate musical connection between the pipes and drums than what American marching bands are accustomed to. Additionally, the pacing of pipe band music is highly dependent on the bagpipes. The anatomy of the instrument presents a variety of unique performance challenges which create a certain ebb and flow to the music that would otherwise be characterized as rushing or dragging. Tempo is also the responsibility of the drums in pipe bands, although they must be more sensitive in making adjustments to the bagpipes, especially when playing in a reduced instrumentation setting. One of the most identifiable differences between the Scottish and American styles is the fact that most tune types in the Scottish style are swung, which, depending on the tempo, is notated using dot and cut rhythms. Throughout history, American rudimental drumming, unless otherwise notated for a certain musical effect, is strictly in straight 16th note time. Another popular performance practice is the use of anticipated accents. That is, an accent anticipating a strong beat, such as a downbeat or an upbeat. Here is a short example of how anticipated accents are used in a pipe band setting. This same practice is also applied with buzz strokes, creating an anticipated buzz. The approach to rolls is very different. Whereas the American rudimental style utilizes open or double stroke roll rudiments, the Scottish style implements exclusively closed or buzz rolls. In Scottish pipe bands, regardless of the tune type being performed, there's always a call to action preceding it in the form of the Scottish roll-off, which is also known as 3-pace rolls or the 25-stroke roll. Like many other traditions of Scottish pipe band drumming, the roll-off is simply a well-known performance practice and is rarely notated. Accented roll patterns are another unique element of the Scottish drumming style. In American rudimental drumming, it's typical to play with what is known as a 2-height system. Accents are played high, which translates to louder, and all other notes, which I'll be referring to as taps, are played lower and much softer to create contrast. When we see accents over the start of a roll in the American style, this indicates a louder attack beginning with the roll articulation indicated. This applies to both open rolls and closed rolls. In pipe band drumming, the approach to accented rolls is much different and features what American drummers commonly refer to as a tap roll, meaning that rather than performing the attack with the accompanying articulation, it is instead played without. Additionally, the space between the accent and the start of the first buzz is always as closed as possible. From an American perspective, in which everything has a strict rhythmic structure, this requires a slight change to the rhythmic value of the roll. The proximity of the buzz to the accents results in the smooth, jazzy texture of pipe band accented roll patterns. Concerning the notation, the accent simply means that the roll begins with a single stroke or a tap, which leaves the amount of emphasis, or lack thereof, to the performer. This results in a much different roll notation style than what American rudimental drummers are accustomed to. The following is a roll chart found in the Basic Principles of the Scottish Style by Alan C. Benson. Here he illustrates both the written and played versions of the most basic accented roll combinations played in pipe bands. Within the stroke roll category, there are also a few single buzz rudiments which are unique to the Scottish style, such as the 4-stroke roll, and the trislet. The following is a short self-composed passage featuring primarily Scottish accented roll combinations. Another unique characteristic of pipe band drumming is the approach to drags. American drags, both rudimental and orchestral, are played in an open style, using a single double stroke at a grace note volume, followed by a primary note. We use this style of drag in combination with single strokes to create rudiments such as the Rudiments, Lesson 25, and a variety of others. The Scottish style also uses this style of drags in rudiments such as the Scottish Rudiments. However, rather than treating it as an articulation, the drag is used in a more open manner. The advanced Scottish rudimental vocabulary is heavily inclusive of closed drags, using what are commonly known as dead strokes, in which the goal is to obtain the shortest buzz possible. This is followed by a primary note to create the Scottish drag. Concerning the notation of Scottish drags, it's simply common knowledge within the pipe band community that this always designates a closed drag. The Scottish drag is also applied in a variety of rudiments and combinations, including, but not limited to, the single drag, the drag single stroke 5, the single drag nil, and the double drag nil. The following is a short, self-composed passage utilizing primarily Scottish drag rudiments. Other rudiments apply the closed drag as a primary note, rather than an accompanying articulation. These include the buzzle and the parabuzzle. To demonstrate how each of these rudiments is used in context, I'll now perform a 2/4 Scottish march entitled Square Wheels by Harvey Dawson, which effectively implements many of the aforementioned performance practices in rudimental vocabulary. Concerning the rudimental vocabulary of Scottish pipe bands, the first complete list of Scottish pipe band rudiments was created by Michael Eagle, who many consider to be the United States Scottish pipe band drumming ambassador. The Scottish Rudiment Project was part of his Expanding the Vocabulary Clinic at the Percussive Arts Society International Convention in 2014, which served as the primary source of motivation for my research. As my research concluded, two important questions remain. Considering the importance of cultural influence on the initial development of these drumming styles, why is there so little crossover between their respective modern forms? In other words, why don't we see more literature written in an American-Scottish hybrid style? And two, if Jimmy Catherwood and Alex Ducker were able to transform the style and rudimental vocabulary of pipe band drumming via influence from jazz, Swiss Basel, and American styles of drumming, what potential applications exist from modern Scottish rudimental style to concert snare drum playing? Although question number one will require further research, I'll now attempt to answer question number two with a series of excerpts from standard solo concert snare drum literature, through which Scottish rudimental influence can be applied. In no way am I advocating that these applications are the correct way of playing them, nor do they abide by composer's intent. There will always be multiple schools of concert snare drum performance, and it is my hope that creative applications in this manner become a new standard through which cultural understanding, music performance practice, and creativity can all come together in perfect harmony. In preparing these examples, I combed through several of the most popular concert snare drum solo books by Anthony Cerrone, Jacques Delacluse, Mitchell Peters, Vic Firth, and several others. I found that the accented roll pattern style was applicable in a wide variety of excerpts. The first example features an accented roll passage in Douze Etudes for Snare Drum, Etude number 2. To review, the concert style of accented rolls begins with the articulation notated, which in this case is a closed buzz roll. Based on the tempo marking of 100 beats per minute, I find that a 16th note roll bass works well. While the presence of the roll does create a sense of continuity throughout the phrase, an alternative argument can be made against this, meaning, since the roll creates uniformity through the accent pattern, the timbral distinction between the accented and unaccented notes becomes distorted. By drawing influence from the Scottish style of accented rolls, one can remove the buzzes from the accents within the roll to achieve a clear distinction between the two. Finally, by moving the first buzz of each grouping as close to the accent as possible, I can achieve a smooth, continuous roll interrupted only by the accents. A few other notable applications include Etude 6 and Keys Clariana, Book 1, Etude 3, This same concept can also be applied to short roll figures that are not connected to another accented buzz. Again, Douze Etudes for Snare Drum is full of passages to apply this, such as Etude 10. Etude 11. And Etudes for Snare Drum by Mitchell Peters. The most effective use I discovered for the Scottish style of accented rolls is the forte piano roll. You'll recall that when these are played in an orchestral or concert style, this is typically approached starting with the buzz. By attacking the roll with an accent, as per Scottish influence, percussions, the resonant decay and timbral contrast it provides has the ability to mask the presence of the roll for a short period of time. The next application concerns shifting from buzz rolls to quick single strokes in Douze Etudes for snare drum, Etude 9. Based on the tempo, the average educated percussionist would likely use a triplet roll bass with single strokes on the 32nd notes. What makes this passage difficult is the transition out of the rolls and into the single strokes. From an orchestral percussionist's perspective, the first inclination would likely involve changing the roll bass. At dotted quarter equals 63, using 2 strokes per roll is too slow and lacks the intensity needed for the first 2 rolls. The next fastest roll bass would be 3 strokes per roll, which is a bit too fast for many players. The issue at hand is that there's not a roll bass in between 2 and 3 strokes per 8th note. However, if we look to the Scottish style for influence, there may be a few possibilities. As demonstrated in the previous passage, the pipe band style of accented rolls features an accented single stroke attack with the roll immediately following it. However, this attack does not have to be accented and can be as close to the single stroke attack as we desire. So, if balanced properly, one can even mask the presence of the attack entirely. Although the Western notation of such a rhythm seems unorthodox, performing the passage in this style does create slightly more space between the last buzz stroke of each roll and the downbeat of the single strokes. A healthy compromise between the 2 styles would be a roll bass of 2 32nd notes and a 16th note. This results in the same number of buzzes as the triplet, but moves the last buzz far enough away from the following downbeat to set up the single strokes more fluidly. Next is the application of Scottish 4-stroke rolls. One of the conveniences of 4-stroke rolls is that the buzz is sandwiched between the attack and release, making transitioning to and from them incredibly easy. Solo number 15 in Advanced Snare Drum Studies by Mitchell Peters presents a variety of rolls that would typically be approached with quick, alternating 5 strokes. By replacing the 5 strokes with 4 strokes and adjusting the length of the buzz, passages of this nature can be played with ease while still achieving the desired musical effect. Other applications of the 4-stroke roll include Portraits in Rhythm, number 26. This particular passage highlights the fact that 4-stroke rolls do not necessarily have to be alternated, and in this case can actually be used to create uniformity in our sticking choice. For example, if I choose to alternate the 32nd note singles in beats 3 and 4, I can also alternate the 4-stroke rolls. Or, if I plan on playing the single strokes with right-hand lead, I can do the same with the 4-stroke rolls. Four-stroke rolls can also be applied in triplet form, with the accent on any one of the 3 partials. A great example of this is Etudes for snare drum, number 6. Another is number 8. The trislet is essentially a 4-stroke roll with one additional note added to create a triplet feel. A great example of how these can be applied in a Western context is Peters' Advanced Snare Drum Studies Solo 11. Similar to previous passages, the average percussionist would likely play single buzzes for a passage like this. By applying the Scottish trislet, I can alleviate the abrasiveness of that single buzz. I also encountered a wide variety of situations in which both four-stroke rolls and trislets can be used in a singular passage, such as Advanced Snare Drum Studies, solo number 8. A similar approach can be taken with solo number 14. It's also possible to breed Scottish and American rudiments into hybrids, such as the fla-fla four-stroke. I found use for this in Hard Times by Mitchell Peters, solo number 1. The last and perhaps most obvious application of the Scottish style is the essence of swing. This can easily be done in American rudimental solos, such as the Pinecone and Forest by John Pratt. Anticipated accents can also be applied. The value of studying other cultures and drumming styles cannot be overstated. Finding ways to incorporate other styles of music into our own is one of the most simple and effective forms of musical innovation. The examples demonstrated throughout this lecture recital represent only a small portion of those possibilities. Considering the rapid evolution of drumming styles in the past 60 years, perhaps it is time to reevaluate the potential cross-cultural applications of their modern forms. Throughout my research, I've had the opportunity to interview a variety of experts in this field, whom I should thank publicly for their time. These include Jeff Moore, John Scolio, Harvey Dawson, Michael Eagle, Alan C. Benson, and Mick O'Neill. Michael Eagle, who is considered to be one of the leading ambassadors of Scottish, Swiss, and American rudimental drumming styles, has produced a variety of Scottish-American hybrid compositions, one of which I'll perform for you shortly. He has spent years working diligently to expand the rudimental vocabulary through this same approach. Mr. Eagle's knowledge and professional expertise heavily influenced my research, for which I am incredibly grateful. In closing, I will now perform 3 compositions demonstrating the Scottish-American and Scottish-American hybrid rudimental drumming styles. I hope that this lecture was informative, and I look forward to presenting more research on this topic in the future.